and welcome to the IAPR Podcast. Today, I am joined by the winner of the IAPR Conference's Early Career Researcher Award, Dr. Robert Arrowood, who is an Assistant Professor of Psychology at University of Virginia's College at Wise, also known as UVA Wise. So welcome, Dr. Arrowood. It's really lovely to have you on.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Once again, I want to congratulate you on winning that award. It was really great to meet you when we were out there in Birmingham this year.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I was so thrilled whenever I got the email and was a little shocked, honestly, but incredibly pleased.
Well deserved as well. So for those who weren't able to attend the conference, Robert did give a really fantastic talk at the conference as part of winning it. So it was just really, really great to hear him talk about the work that he's been doing, which we're going to also discuss on this podcast today. So speaking of, before we get into what you are doing, in your research that helped you win that award, I kind of have a couple of questions about your academic backgrounds. Firstly, what is your academic background? Like, how did you get into academia? And I think more importantly for this podcast, how did you get and become interested in the psychology of religion?
Sure. So I have a little bit of a weird academic background in the sense it was a little bit of a surprise to my entire family when I said I wanted to go to college in the first place, because I was a first generation low income student for any sort of college. And so I went to a small liberal arts college called, at the time it was called Tusculum College. Now it's changed to Tusculum University, but it's still a small liberal arts college where I kind of accidentally stumbled upon psychology. I had some interests in marriage and family therapy at the time because just from like personal background stuff with my family. And I kind of found psychology that way, realized that I would have been an awful therapist, which I still say I would be an awful therapist now. But thankfully, I took a research methodology class with Dr. Brian Pope, who I'm still close with, and we've collaborated on a few things. And he sort of introduced me to the idea of asking questions and the stuff I'm interested in, being able to test those questions. Through that, I started looking at my own interest within the psychology of religion and existentialism. Upon graduating there, I actually went to the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, where I was incredibly honored to work with Dr. Ralph Hood. Anyone in psych of religion is well familiar with his contributions to the field. And so working with him was literally a dream. And so he really taught me that foundational work in the psychology of religion and just research methodology that I wouldn't have got from a more like quantitative perspective background. So I learned so much unique stuff from him. From there, I did go more on the existential route. So my doctorate's in experimental social psychology from Texas Christian University, where I worked under Dr. Kathy Cox. And I graduated from there in 2020, where I did private sector research for a number of years during COVID. The job market was quite difficult. I had a really good postdoc lined up. Due to COVID, the funding got cut, and so I found myself looking for a job. Stumbled at Cook Children's Healthcare Center, where I worked for a number of years just doing research, mostly within the hospital, but academia has always kind of been my true calling. And I like the sort of freedom to study what I want to study, because it's you can do psychology of religion at the hospital, certainly, but at the end of the day, their bottom line matters more than my own personal research interests. And so that's how I found my way here at UVA Wise, where, like you said, I'm assistant professor of psychology, teaching, and also running my research lab.
Which is fantastic to hear that you've also got your own research lab, which is something I imagine many researchers, especially early career researchers, aspire to be able to do. So I'm actually curious, what was the process for which you could kind of have your own research lab? What was that journey like?
So it was part of the reason I was brought here in the first place was because of my research background. There was absolutely research being done at UVA Wise within multiple departments. Our Nat Science department does a lot of research. Within social sciences, or psychology specifically, there was research being done, but it was much more focused on taking students to conferences, keeping it in-house, getting experience in classes. Whenever I got back on the job market to look for an academic job, on the one hand, I was looking for a place where I could teach, because I do value teaching and interacting with students. But they were looking for someone who could teach, but who could also create kind of a lab. And so I was intentionally hired to jumpstart a little more research and to keep publishing and to involve students more and more with the research process. So I was hired mostly to do that. So it was a fortunate kind of turn of events that I was able to land here.
Perfect time, perfect place kind of situation. Mm-hmm. That's really cool. As you said, you were looking for jobs and you had a postdoc lined up and it fell away from you, but suddenly this new opportunity comes up. So I guess that suggests to people, if you do keep looking, maybe you will find something for those other people watching if they're on YouTube, or listening, if they're listening on wherever we have our podcasts. But yeah, that's interesting. And so now that you've got your own research lab, you have been doing some research now over the last 5 or so years on existentialism.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in part your introduction and your avenue into psychology of religion, as far as I'm aware. So do you mind having a quick summing up of what your area of research is and how that might relate to the psychology of religion for people who are listening?
Sure. So I was heavily trained out of primarily terror management theory. That was my PhD under Kathy Cox. She's a terror management theorist. That was the thing that got me really interested in research in the first place, partly because as an undergrad in psychology, the taboo nature of talking about death and just sort of the darker stuff, I don't know if it says something about my personality, but I always found that incredibly interesting, even as a younger person growing up in a fundamentalist church when I wasn't supposed to be talking about those things. I found them fascinating. So when I found out there was a research area aligned with studying these more taboo, darker things that aren't for polite conversations, but that also have far-reaching implications. I mean, we're discussing prejudice, discussing nationalism, discussing why people can do some really atrocious things, but also why people can grow and flourish. That really attracted me within terror management. But at the same time, I was also really reading like Dan Batson's work in Quest Religiosity and Religious Doubts. And I noticed just a sort of a niche area, because terror management for a long time has said you're going to be certain in your worldviews. And for a worldview to work, you have to be certain. And when death is salient, and I'm generalizing quite a bit here, and so when death is salient or when existentially threatened, you should kind of double down on whatever your worldviews are for the most part. There's individual differences that matter. And so for a quester, someone who naturally doubts their religion, right? Someone who's uncertain by default, this is now saying they're going to become more certain in their uncertainty. And so I latched onto that and found that incredibly interesting. Started conducting research with questers. At the same time, John, Ken Vale, myself, and Ralph Hood put out that special issue of Religion, Brain, and Behavior, where we challenged existential psychology, or experimental existential psychology, especially terror management, and said, if we're going to continue to do this, we've got to start taking individual differences seriously, or more seriously. And moreover, we've got to start this inter-dialogue with the psychology of religion, because most in existential psych have often been trained in social psychology. And there's nothing wrong with it. I was trained in social psychology, but by not having sort of a religious studies background, or by not involving people whose entire expertise is studying religion or the psychology of religion and spirituality, we're missing nuance here. And so, putting my money where my mouth is, I published my first study with Quest Religiosity and Terror Management, showing, hey, not all religious belief is effective at managing death concerns, or it's at least not as effective as, say, like intrinsic belief or just fundamentalist belief or something like that. And so I saw these marked differences, pretty strong effect sizes too, among questers, and kept running studies on that, looking at more ways that questers are becoming more certain in their uncertainty, how they're coping with existential crisis, because they don't cope as well in some cases, but in other cases with like isolation, they cope a little bit better. And so it was really this question that I had, and noticing this paradox of certainty and the uncertain, that really drove a lot of my research interests.
That's really interesting to hear, especially because you've got something that I guess isn't spoken about a lot in psychology of religion, is this quest religiosity. And for those who are listening, who they're undergraduates or master's level people who haven't necessarily heard of these types of religiosities, do you want to just expand on that? Because we've got a wide listening body on this. It's not just people who are already well entrenched in the research field. So there are different types of religiosities, and I'd like you to expand on what you mean by quest religiosity.
Sure. So when I think of the classic, I think of Allport and Ross's work on intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic is this religion as end, as he would say. So the goal of your belief is the belief. You internalize your belief. The reason you are religious is for the sake of the religion. Extrinsic, on the other hand, that's religion as means. It's largely using your religion. So you might value the teachings, you might value the potluck dinners or the social aspect, but also you just might value what you get from it. So it's using religion versus being religion, so to speak. And there's been more research on that. It's not one or the other necessarily. It's an individual difference, where you can score high on both of them. I think that's the indiscriminately pro-religious, where you're both intrinsic and extrinsic. Dan Batson, though, his work kind of pushed a little bit back against that. At the time, it was a dichotomy, but pushed back against that intrinsic, extrinsic. So there's a little more going on. And he proposed religion as quest, where you value the exploration. It's not agnosticism. I want to stress that. That's the common question I get is, am I just studying agnostics? And no, that's not what I'm doing. Quest is, these are people who would identify as religious. They would identify probably within a theological tradition, or at least within a spiritual tradition, but they use their religious belief to grow. They use it to explore. They're interested in novelty. So these would be people, say, who would be within a faith tradition, who would read their religious text and say, it says this, but is this deeper meaning? Is this allegory for something else? Or is this, is this man's interpretation of something that we couldn't understand, right? They're going to ask questions. They're going to be uncertain. On the opposite end, you could largely contrast questers with fundamentalists who do take a more literal stance on their faith tradition, a much more rigid, a much more dogmatic approach compared to a quester. And so those are the four big ones. There's other individual differences, but I think for this sake, those are the four we might stick with.
Being able to, as you mentioned, address stuff that's in the literature, like this perceived dichotomy that was intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. This idea was considered dichotomy for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And it's always fascinating to me when you find that you can just push back on that potentially and say, actually, what happens if there's more going on here that we haven't even thought to consider? Is there something more going on than just these two polar opposite things? Is there something either in between or something different entirely that we haven't considered? So that's always something that I like, not just in psychology of religion, but in academia generally, when it often happens where someone is an early career researcher and they're coming in with a new frame of mind, they're coming in with a new approach because they've not been entrenched and kind of around this body of work for so long, so they can come and ask different questions, which often happens, and I quite enjoy that. That leads me actually to another question based on what you said, and you were talking about how a lot of these conversations are considered quite taboo, especially talking about death. But what happens if you come across a society or a group that don't find conversations around death to be taboo in any way? For example, that is the case in Christianity, but in a lot of Jewish families, talking about death and just death as being a fact of life, that is just a common conversation. And it's not going to be like every single day they'll talk about death, but it's not a topic that they will necessarily shy away from. I think that's possibly because as a community they've experienced a lot of death throughout their history, but also it's just not considered a taboo topic. So what would you say, based on your research, kind of your understanding, you talk about individual differences, is the specific religious beliefs that people hold and therefore the kind of cultures that they kind of are in, does that affect how they experience existential thought and the existential psychology aspect?
I really love that question, because even outside of religion too, we're seeing the groups like have a living will. We're seeing that push across multiple cultures and across multiple nations of let's make death a much more talked about part of life, because we're seeing family members who, unfortunately, because death is kind of taboo with many cultures, they don't have plans or directives for after they pass. And that's kind of left on the surviving members to have to pick up the pieces while they're grieving, right? And so there are definitely pushes to make this a much more common talk. Still, though, there's something icky about death, right? If we want to go very strict within terror management, and if we want to go very strict, they would say it's the most terrifying thing, at least at an unconscious level, that it's this unconscious fear of death that drives much of what we do. And the reason we're able to have conversations about death like this is our defenses are working as they should, right? And so it would say that the people who are more comfortable talking about death, or who are in groups that are able to manage, their defenses are working better. It's the ones who are struggling that their defenses might not be working as well as they would want them to. But to that end, that does raise another really good point, because something that I think is a very fair criticism of existential psychology as a whole, or at least the way we like to think about experimental existential with like terror management, meaning maintenance, state trait existential isolation, those theories and frameworks, it is very, very Judeo-Christian centric. With the bulk of the studies, and by bulk, I don't have an actual number, but from my guesstimate, I would say 70-80%, if not more, of the studies have been done on Christians, right? And even more so than that, white Christian college women around 18 to 20 years old. Ralph Hood, he always used to joke, and I loved it. It might be a little, but he would always joke and say, even the damn rat was white. In studies. That is a real problem. And so, as you mentioned, death is more of a taboo topic in many areas within Christianity. And most of what we've studied within or at least within terror management and existential psych, has been on white Christianity. And so that's a real criticism. Now, to that end, many of my colleagues have been doing more of this outside of, really outside of the United States, or outside of the UK. And they are finding some solid replication, quite frankly. So they're seeing it within Islam. We're seeing it within Judaism. We're seeing replication of terror management effects within Hinduism. My colleague just recently replicated an effect within Shinto. So we're seeing replication showing that at the minimum, death is icky. And at a conscious level is often icky. And if you even if you're ready to talk about death, there's often that little pause, right? And that little just, looking around, are we ready to talk about this? At the unconscious level, terror management, again, would say it's the most terrifying thing ever. And again, if we follow natural selection, it should be the thing we're trying to avoid, because proliferation of the genes and passing on and living. But at least at the conscious level, we're probably all a little icked by it.
That is genuinely interesting that you're seeing replication in different cultures in which they believe in, for example, reincarnation and stuff like that. So where the concept of death isn't even itself a definite end of their corporeal being. Because even in Christianity, whilst they have a spirit that lives on, they don't consider themselves to continue on in this world, right? They go on to either, an afterlife of some kind that is separate from this world in some capacity. Whereas religiosities that have reincarnation, or potentially having your spirit stick around as an ancestor spirit or something like that in this world, you would think might have less of a concern about death, because they're still going to be on this plane of existence, as it were. So that is an interesting thing to hear, that you're still seeing replication in those communities, not just of the existential psychology side of it, but also the taboo around death. That to me, that's quite interesting, that people still have this ickiness, because this is purely an anecdotal thing from me, but having grown up in North London in the UK, which is, as many people who are from the area will know, there's a very, very large Jewish population in Northwest London in particular. And as a result, just death always seemed to be, it was not a taboo topic of conversation. It just wasn't. And the idea that someone dies, is okay, whatever, you go and sit shiver, and that happens. It might be the case that you just talk about things with, your aunt died, that's okay, and let's just chat about it. The funeral, she died yesterday and the funeral is today, because you get buried almost immediately in Judaism. That is in fact kind of Jewish custom, to make sure that they are buried within, I believe it's 48 hours, but it might even be 24 hours if you can. And as a result, planning for one's death, and as you said, something that's happening in America where people aren't necessarily planning for their own death, and all of that is being left to the people who remain. That's not so much, at least in my sphere of North London Jewry, that's not really been my experience of it. So it's really fascinating to hear that even in cultures where death is potentially spoken about more, you still find all of these same effects.
And again, some of this is very in early stages. I can't stress that enough. But even some is just so subtle. Like, for instance, using eye tracking work, we're seeing the pupil dilation, right, which is suggestive of physiological arousal. Again, suggesting something's happening there. I, as a terror management person, do interpret that as that ickiness. Who knows, maybe with that physiological stuff, maybe it's an interest taking and that sort of thing. So I think the field is, quite frankly, open for doing more of this and really getting to the nuance of those questions.
Speaking of the field being open and ready for nuance taking, do you want to talk us through a little bit about the research that you have done in the last couple of years, and broad strokes rather than specifics, but like broad strokes of the kind of ideas that you're looking to explore in the coming couple of years in your work, and if you can expand upon why you've approached research in that way.
Sure. So all of my interests, for the most part, have really stemmed around sort of this quest for religiosity and existentialism. I've published a little out of that, but everything kind of brings me back to that area. My first interest there, and where I've probably published the most, is out of terror management and just general death concerns. So showing that questers, just really quest beliefs, aren't as well suited to manage this very specific existential concern. And when I say that, I mean specifically death, compared to, say, a fundamentalist or an intrinsic. And so I have tons of studies at this point. Daryl Van Tongeren has tons of studies. Ken Vale has tons of studies at this point, kind of showing that questers struggle existentially. They want to explore. They're interested in this stuff, but there's consequences to it. I'm thinking like Janaea's work showing like the consequences of questers: higher anxiety, higher depression, higher instances of stress, higher mental illness, which again fits so well with existential theory. And so it really begged the question, if we're seeing they're not well contending with death, they're not contending well with meaning, I'm thinking that's Daryl Van Tongeren's work, why is this kind of maintained, right? Why is this belief structure that people are kind of maybe intentionally choosing to go out and seek out novelty and grow and explore, what are they getting from this? What benefit has to be outweighing it? And so I recently started looking within existential isolation, one of the other big existential threats. And ultimately, we're finding questers are really well existentially connected. So they may struggle a bit with death, they may struggle a bit with meaning, but their existential connection is very strong. And they're actually, my colleagues and I actually kind of argue that they're universal I sharers. So an I sharer is someone who can get validation from anything or from a variety of stuff, even something that's challenging their beliefs. And so like a quester who takes, say, a quest Christian, for example, this will begin, they believe in Christianity, the core tenets of whatever their specific faith tradition. They have some doubts, they have some uncertainties, they want to explore. And so if they're interacting with someone of an entirely different faith tradition, even someone who's very hostile towards Christianity, they could get validation from that because they're exploring. They are getting their needs, at least their exploration needs, met by this interaction with someone who holds a different belief than them. And so on the isolation side of existentialism, they're well protected. There's also research coming out showing that their identity needs are pretty strong, actually. They have a pretty strong sense of who they are. They're not sort of this identity foreclosure. They're open to exploring, but they're comfortable with their identity, which is again suggesting if you have an existential issue, whatever is causing that issue should be really good at some other existential issue. And so that's really what I've been working on lately. And I've been using Quest kind of as the model, but there's tons of it because we can look at intrinsic religiosity showing that they're really good with death. They're really good with meaning. They struggle with some identity issues and they're very threatened by identity. Outside of religion, personal need for structure, they kind of follow the Quest route. They struggle a little bit with death and meaning, but are pretty good with isolation, or at least theoretically pretty good with isolation. So this sort of existential trade-off hypothesis, I have a paper that's been accepted at the archive now that actually outlines a little bit of this. Some of my colleagues and I are working on a follow-up to that to really outline the existential trade-off, because not that it was an afterthought in the paper for the archive, but it was tentatively introduced just to kind of wade my feet to see how it was received. I introduced it at IAPR, it was well received. And so my colleagues and I are working on a full paper kind of outlining how if you have one major domain of issue with existentialism, to keep it around, it should be really good at something else. So a lot of my time's been going to that lately.
And for those who aren't aware, I'm suddenly very cognizant of the fact that we're talking about existential terminology, about isolation and connection and things like that. And kind of these are ways of answering the question of kind of like, what am I? Who am I? Why am I? That kind of thing, these kind of really large existential questions about the self and the self in relation to the world and others around us. So that's when you're talking about connection and isolation. You're talking about, literal, existential isolation, existential connection, that kind of thing, rather than just the terms isolation as it might be used in kind of interpersonal psychology. You're not talking about interpersonal isolation. You're not talking about interpersonal connections. This is from an existential point of view, just wanting to clarify that, because we're using those terms without the prefix of existential, purely because that's the assumption, because we're talking about existential psychology.
And again, I appreciate the clarification, because I really find this stuff fascinating, and I find it so easy for me to jump from point A to point Z very quickly as I get excited kind of talking about this stuff.
And that passion comes across very well, both whenever you talk about this, and it definitely came across in your talk at the IAPR, but also in your writing. It's very clear that you are passionate about this topic, and as a result, the work that you're doing in the area is really good. Because you're so passionate about it, you want to do it really well, and that comes across quite clearly from my perspective.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't know why I love this dark stuff, but I do.
And everyone has their thing. For me, I really like the biochemistry of the brain when people do stuff, and that's what drives my interest. And whenever people talk about stuff and we can look at stuff when people are doing religious ritual or something, I just want to know, okay, but what's happening in their brain when they do this? What's chemically happening right now to make them feel this way? I want to know. And different people will have different things that drive their interest. And I guess so long as you follow that drive to wanting to know more about a topic, you're probably going to do it well, so that you find the answer, because you're not going into it to make up answers. You're going in to find the answers to the questions that we have. That's kind of the ideal behind academia, at least for me, is you're not just doing a tick box exercise. You're not just going, well, I did this piece of research and here is the paper. It's, I have this question that no one currently knows the answer to. I've looked it up and no one else has done the research to find the answer. I really want to know the answer to this question. What would be the best way to find that answer? Let me design a study to do that. And that comes across very strongly in your work, that that's the process that you have followed. You're doing work because you are desperate to find the answers, rather than just producing papers for the sake of producing papers. And
I think we're seeing a lot of that with kind of the changing zeitgeist in academia, especially because we've learned from the replication crisis. Are we out of the replication crisis? I can't say that. But we have learned from some of the issues of the past. And I do see a lot of scholars that were getting their training around that time or shortly following that time have been very focused on, let's do something meaningful, something that will replicate, and that there won't be as many questions. Because there's always going to be questions in science, right? But there won't be as many, data questions or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I actually, that's something else that came up at the conference, was the Open Psychology of Religion project that was done between multiple journals in the field of psychology. It was spoken about quite significantly in the pre-conference, which was a kind of a methods pre-conference. This move to a more open way of doing science is something I'm actually very, very proud of about the psychology of religion as a whole, because compared to other parts of psychology, I think it is definitely towards the front, if not leading the way, in that push towards transparency, openness, and the ability to replicate. The push for doing registered reporting, or really the expectation of pre-registration as a minimum, that kind of thing, is really, really good to see. As someone who did publish about this and criticizing quite heavily some of the psychology of religion journals back in 2019, kind of back in my PhD days, when we looked at all of the journals, and none of the psychology of religion journals were doing anything to do with pre-registration. They didn't care about pre-registration. They weren't really caring about, they didn't even know what registered reporting was. And so to see this transition from basically an entire body of and subfield effectively not registering this as a thing that needed to happen, and 6 years later, it's now very much ahead of the field. It's given that you've pre-registered something as a base. Like, if you haven't, then people will absolutely be asking questions. It's like that, of course you pre-registered the study, because that's a done thing. And I really like that change that we've seen in the field in the space of as little as 6 years.
I mean, think with pre-registration, huge, but even think about our sample sizes we're putting out now. Adam Cohen gave, in my opinion, one of the best keynote addresses I've ever witnessed at the Society for Personality and Social Psychology 2 years ago, where he talked about what is psychology of religion doing well and what can the rest of the field learn from us. And we were some of the first to be doing these large scale cross-cultural, probably not the first. There's other fields doing this, but we really pushed hard to do these large scale cross-cultural projects with thousands of participants, even in experimental design in some cases. We were some of the early ones who jumped on, as you said, we jumped a little late on pre-registration, but we're really focused on it now. We jumped on transparent methodology. So even if you're not necessarily pre-registered, at least put it on the open science framework, right? So I think as a field, we're doing a really good job of really answering some of the issues that the replication crisis brought up.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And it's something that I've long been an advocate for. And it's something that I'm really excited to see now, where beforehand, it was people treated the stuff like that like it was special. And now it's just considered normal. And when a practice is normalized like that, especially a practice that encourages and incentivizes good scientific outputs, then just the base quality of scientific outputs in the field will go up. And this is one of the reasons that I said that your work is clearly really good, because you can see that it's all theory driven. This is very much, here is theory. From this theory, we should expect X. Now, do we actually find X, or do we find something else entirely? But you can see that everything that you've done is pulled from theory, and as a result, it is just good work. And if people aren't aware of your work, I strongly recommend they go away and just read a couple of your papers, because it is very obvious that the stuff that you do is pulled purely from theory. So it's just so nice to see really strong work being done.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning, working under Ralph was just influential on who I am as a researcher. And that was his approach. As a 22-year-old master's student, fresh out of undergrad, going into his office for the very first time, I had just started classes that day. And he tells me, it's like, okay, here's 10 books. I need you to have them read in a week. And they were just dense. Like he handed me Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And it was that level of stuff. And he was very, very focused on making sure that everything we did, at minimum, it came back to theory. And it came back to well-validated and well-supported theory. And so I cannot underplay how influential he was in my own practice now, because that came from him knowing theory and knowing how it fits well.
And I think Ralph Hood has had such an influential effect on the whole field that it's impossible to overstate his effect on the field across his career. So something I just want to clarify, because I did ask, not sure we got an answer for it. Have you got any plans in terms of research over the next couple of years, even if it's just broad strokes? You don't have to be super specific, but broad strokes, kind of what kind of questions are you interested in approaching and exploring in the next couple of years?
Sure. Yeah. So sorry for jumping over that. I do have a package of studies that I'm kind of working on right now that will take some time, right? That are really trying to tease apart this sort of identity aspect among questers. Because on the one hand, yes, they seem pretty confident in their identities. They don't seem as threatened by them. But what is the identity? And so I've really been leaning into like Daryl Van Tongeren and Patty Van Capellen, and I think Nathan DeWall's on it. There's stuff on like the religious duns and religious residue, because I do have a study right now kind of showing that most religious people, when forced to identify a quester, they actually identify them as an atheist. So this is a person, in some of the writing samples we're using in the studies, it explicitly says, I still believe I am not an atheist or agnostic. And yet when you ask people after reading this passage about doubt, uncertainty, they say, no, this is an atheist. And so they're not really getting the religious residue, right? Even though they're still religious. So it might not be the best analogy. Which has sort of led me into this hypodescent literature of like multiculturalism and how we view people who have a foot in both camps. Because a quester does. They have a foot in the religious camp and a foot in the non-religious camp. And so we're kind of finding that if people identify them as secular, even though they're not, the consequences come with that. Like I think it was Gervais' work. I think Mandy Robbins also had some work showing like the consequences, how people like just distrust atheists in general. I think it was a doctor. They don't want an atheist doctor to perform a surgery. if questers, even though they're religious, are viewed as atheists, they should also have those sort of consequences with them. So I'm really interested in exploring the consequences of the quest identity outside of like existential, just the social consequences. But even more so, I'm really focused on using like applied terror management. It's really easy to say this is how death works in the lab, right? But there's death reminders everywhere: cemeteries, car crashes, the evening news, all sorts of things can prime death, which, if terror management's correct in how it influences thoughts, feelings, and behavior, that should influence our daily lives. And so getting terror management out of the lab and into the real world is a huge area that I'm really focused on now.
This is just a follow-up question to what you just said, that your ideas of looking at the social consequences. You were talking before, just a little bit ago, about psychology, religion, looking, being the first, or at least one of the major subfields in psychology, looking at doing cross-cultural studies. And one of the big criticisms of existential psychology is that it's been very weird in nature, i.e. kind of looking at Western, educated, democratic, as you mentioned, white, 18 to 22-year-old students who are largely psychology students in particular. Do you have a plan on looking outside, like specifically looking outside that group when you're looking at the social consequences? Or especially because I think a lot of that research that was looking at the distrust of atheists, especially, was done in America. And so you would expect to see that in America, but in countries like, I don't know, like say Norway or Sweden, where atheism is kind of either a majority kind of thing, or at least perceived to be a very secular country. And so we may not see those same social consequences there. And just to clarify as well, religious duns are people who used to be religious and no longer are. So you used the word duns earlier. Darrell's work has kind of distinguished between religious nuns, so people who were never religious, religious duns, and people who were religious but no longer are. And the residue that you mentioned about people still trusting people who, like, they trust people who were once religious but no longer are, more than people who were never religious. And small bits of residue like that, that's what you're referring to. So I do wonder, do you have any plans to compare cross-culturally, even if it's still a Western democratic country like Norway or Sweden or some other North European country which is traditionally considered to be quite secular?
So a position that I've recently accepted, I was honestly quite honored. Myself and Christopher Silver at Sewanee were just recently offered visiting scholar positions at Wrexham in Wales. And so obviously still some weird population here, honestly, but this position with Mandy Robbins at Wrexham was intentionally brought out to increase collaboration. And to increase the ability to, at minimum, even just the UK and the US, increasing that is more than some areas are doing. But it also opens up the market to connect us with other European scholars to where we can start to look, because this is something that, especially with some of my work on secularity, I'm highly cognizant of. The United States is a largely non-secular location. And what we are finding in regards to religion and secularity very well may not, and in some cases probably will not, replicate in larger. And so I'm okay with saying that a lot of what we find is within a cultural context. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying findings can be within a cultural context, but I'm highly conscious of that. And so at minimum, to try to combat some of that, I do try to do a lot of the larger online crowdsourcing, which has its own issues, and try to target non-United States and non-UK. But this Wrexham position is intended to increase cross-collaboration. And so I'm meeting colleagues there who are not from the UK and not from the US, who are able to help get me in touch with people that will help collect data. So I actually now have a colleague at the University of Essex that we're working on a project together, which is a much more secular area. And it's interesting because she wants me to collect data from a religious group, a sample, and she's collecting the same study from a more secular sample. And we're going to see how those two things compare.
I like that a lot, that even in my mind, the UK is still, it's kind of this halfway house between this American quite religious culture and what I would imagine to be like kind of an incredibly secular culture of Northern Europe. And the UK very much treats itself like it's a secular nation, but it's still quite culturally religious in many ways. So it's interesting to see what they do in Essex, what they're doing on secular individuals, and how secular will it be. And that's going to be its own kettle of fish that you're going to have to try and disentangle. You mentioned also that you were looking at online recruiting. I have been recently made aware from colleagues from other fields, this is not just psychology, religion, but other fields, who have started doing online studies. And they have mentioned how in the last, kind of especially the last 12 months, that they've effectively had to get crash courses in bot detection and ways in which you recruit might have to, unfortunately, would lead to fewer people partaking, because rather than just leaving a link up to a questionnaire on a website, having effectively a two-stage process where you have a link to a form that they have to fill out to get, like, to put their email address in, and then you email them a specific one, single person link, try and make it so that if that link is used 2 or 3 times, they can see, so long as only one of those is complete, then that's probably one person. But if you can see that one link has been used 100 times, suddenly that's probably a botnet. And so have you considered or have been approached or taught any bot detection stuff if you're planning on using any online recruitment techniques?
I would say I lose nearly 50% of my participants when I do online stuff, just because they are bots, or people, if it might actually be a real person with a different account just trying to take it and get the payment, right? It is incredibly unfortunate. And I mean, even this is not a new problem, though, because I'm thinking those of us who used mTurk back in 2016, 2017, we just, in all honesty, we just weren't as good at detecting it. So I've got the range of bot detectors that I've pulled from, I don't remember the citations offhand, but I've pulled them off from others who are doing it. But it's a real problem. And I don't think that it's a problem that we have a direct solution to anytime soon, because I mean, even using the same link, that at the minimum, that increases manpower, that increases the amount you're going to have to request for on grants, that increases the amount of money you're going to have to request to pay participants. So that slows down the research quite drastically. And it still doesn't fix some of the bots, because now that we've come up with this, the next thing the bot's just going to find, or the automated AI is just going to find a way to work its way around that, right? One of my studies got leaked, one of the links to it, where they had to email me to sign up for it. It's a study we're doing in-house at UVA-Wise. Only people in the area, I mean, I guess anyone could participate, but no one's going to drive 6 and 7 hours to come and participate in a 30-minute study, right? To sign up for it, they had to email me or my lab manager. And I got 900 emails in a 2-hour span because my email address and the study, because we were paying people, got leaked online. And it was all just coming from bots. So it would be like Sam Smith 91, Sam Smith 10, just Bill whatever 5. It's a huge problem, and I don't see it going anywhere soon. But there are, the best thing we can do now is just follow what the literature's saying. And one thing I really like to do with the end, that honestly bots struggle with, at least from my experience, I ask honest questions at the end. Say, this won't impact your payment, anything like that. Should we actually use your data? If yes, why? If no, why? Just give me a sentence or so. How accurate were you actually? And obviously we've got the social desirability, the attention checks, things like that. But just asking people, I found people are pretty no, I breezed through it pretty quick. No, you shouldn't use my data for whatever reason. It'll be like, I didn't put any effort. And I found that is actually really helpful at getting rid of bad participants and bots in some cases, because bots see that and it's automatically, nope, I'm a perfect participant. And I'm like, okay, you're probably a bot. And that makes me scrutinize it a little more.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's the kind of thing that I've also seen other people use. There's something, now that you're going to be associated with the UK universities, there's something that is quite prevalent in the UK called Riot Science, a group of researchers. It's now international, but that originally started at King's College in London, and has spread out from there, put on effectively summer schools about reproducible science, doing, it's kind of reproducible, open, transparent science is basically the idea, and teaching people, one, techniques of how to do this, and two, getting people to understand this. But in their recent summer school that they had over the summer just gone, they spoke about kind of bot detection and the sad need for people to become experts in bot detection when that is not a skill that academics are taught. That's not something that you get taught in an undergraduate degree or a master's degree or even during your PhD, but it's something you have to pick up. So yeah, and research and this academic field will be forever evolving. It's never going to be stagnant, but whatever comes next. I look forward to reading more of your work because, like I mentioned earlier, it's great work. So I'm excited to read whatever it is that you're doing, especially with your collaboration with Wrexham and Essex.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm excited for what's coming next, especially this cross-collaborative work, because that's how we grow as a field. We get experience, we get scholars who are not our little echo chamber that we were trained with. Nothing against publishing with the same people. I do, but that's really how you innovate and learn new stuff.
Agreed. Before we wrap up, just because I've used almost an hour of your time at the moment, is there anything that you want to speak about that you haven't already spoken about, or are you happy with everything that we've covered today?
I as long as you're happy, I'm pretty happy. I guess if you're looking for a soundbite, it's dark stuff can be fun, right? And you can make a career on taboo stuff.
And so I think that's a lovely soundbite to end with. So I'd just like to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for
I know
having me.
you're a busy man, and good luck with the new collaborations that you've got, and also with any work that you've already got underway.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a nice day.
You as well.